All right, let's start. Okay, so first things first, let me introduce myself. Hi, everybody. My name is Shridha. I am a YES alumni from Malaysia. And I actually went on the program in 2016 and I was hosted in Versailles, Indiana. So I'm going live today on the YES program account in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. So today I'm going to be interviewing another YES alumni from Malaysia, Celine, and we're going to be talking about disability rights, inclusivity, as well as advocating for persons with disabilities in our community. So just a little bit of introduction on ADA before we start. 2020 actually marks 30 years since the Americans with Disability Act was signed into legislation. So this was on the 26th of July 1990. And this landmark legislation actually prohibits discrimination based on disability and increases opportunities and access for persons with disabilities. So the law was written and passed to ensure that persons with disabilities have the same rights as any other American. So if you give me just a little bit of time, I'm going to now invite Celine into the interview. Okay, so we're waiting for Celine to connect. I hope everybody is doing fine during this period.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Celine. Yes,
yeah.
I can
Hi,
hear
Shridha.
you.
Can you hear me? Okay, can you see me?
I think your camera needs to be a little lower.
Lower. Is this
Yes.
lower? Like this?
Okay, yeah, I think a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, that's perfect.
All right,
yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
All
Hi,
right.
Celine.
So, hi.
Yep, it's so nice to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
So I guess I should introduce myself.
Yes.
My name is Celine. I'm a YES alumni from Malaysia as well. I went to the program in 2014, so that's like 6 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, I'm studying law in the University of Cambridge, and I'm happy to be here.
It's awesome.
Yep.
All right. So, are you ready to begin? Yeah?
Yep. Let's fire away.
Awesome. All right. So, Celine, what does the Americans with Disabilities Act mean to you?
I think, first of all, hang on. All right.
Yeah.
First of all, it's important to understand that disability rights is essentially, they are a part of human rights.
Yes.
So fundamentally, they are rights by the natural sense of justice.
Mm-hmm.
The ADA is not what creates these rights. The ADA, as you've mentioned earlier, is
Yes.
what makes it unlawful for discriminations, but it is the rights nonetheless.
Yes.
Originally.
Mm-hmm.
But at 15, when I went to America the first time, obviously this was not what I was aware of.
Right.
Growing up in a developing country, we face discriminations every day. Ableisms in community is, more often than not, our rights have been denied and we are deprived of it. So when I went to the US, the ADA is a symbol of hope, I suppose, in a sense, even though, as an exchange student, you're not an American, but you are protected by that right.
That's true.
Your rights are protected. So I think it was an eye-opener for me, a window that shows me that, what it means to have rights and that you have the rights to those rights. Okay, right. So that's how I feel personally about it.
All right, thank you. So can you highlight some positive aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act as experienced from someone who is outside of the US?
It's important to know that despite creating obligations, every day there are still instances where the ADA is not being complied with. For
Right.
instance, something as simple as accessible toilets or restaurants
Mm-hmm.
or shopping, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think what really meant a lot to me as a student under the exchange program was that a lot of opportunities, even though not all, but a lot of opportunities are more open to us, persons with
Yes.
disability, in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if you're keen to do something that regularly, um, people would think that there are lots of barriers to doing. For example, joining a certain activity or a certain program that you want to participate in. The obligation is there to make it accessible to persons with disability. Does that make
Yes.
sense? Yeah. So
Yeah.
that
Mm-hmm.
to me was a valuable opportunity as an exchange
Right.
student there.
Mm-hmm. And it's very different, I think, from Malaysia.
It is. You see, in
Yeah.
Malaysia, in programs, say, for example, like if you are applying to a school, for example,
Yes.
they are, it's very common for them to refuse to accept you as a student or as a participant in whatever they're doing. They can just
Yes.
outright tell you that, no, we don't have the experience. We don't want to have you here. Go away, basically.
Right.
Maybe they say it
Mm-hmm.
nice.
Yes.
That's the
And the
point.
ADA, I think, is very important because it protects those rights. Yeah.
Yes.
As you
Yes,
put
indeed.
it. Mm-hmm. So, since you've been back, how have you been advocating for persons with disabilities?
I think mainly I pushed a lot for activities to be as inclusive as possible.
Right.
So when I came back, I was like 16 years old and stuff. So I was still a
Yeah.
student. I participated in a lot of projects and activities that basically on a very, very, very basic level, trying to push for inclusivity. Um, Take, for example, like programs with the YES Alumni, for instance.
Yeah.
You try to push for them to be as inclusive as possible, opening opportunities and encouraging people with disability to participate. So that's
Yeah.
one thing. And outside of it, outside of the YES Alumni activities as well, everything, you see, up to 20% of the is affected by disability,
Yes.
whether you see it or not. So it's a
Yes.
huge thing. You have to consider it, like, no matter what you do. So yeah.
Right. Could you describe some of the projects that you've done that advocates for persons with disabilities?
Mainly a lot of awareness talks.
Right.
I think in a developing country, you see, it's different from culture to culture, community to community, because each community is at its own level of
Yes.
awareness. So in Malaysia, we are still quite far behind, honestly. So back then, it was a lot of awareness talks, attending a lot of conferences, forums, sharings, things like that.
Yeah.
Some of the programs that are more, let's say, more outstanding with the YES Alumni, for instance, were programs targeting our alumni themselves, trying to
Yes.
raise awareness. So yeah, there were a series of like talks and activities, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And what are some of the challenges that you faced while working on these projects?
I think the most significant one to me is the fact that it's very hard to get participants. Don't get me
Right.
wrong, when people participate, after they participate, they give feedback and they say that, wow, I've learned so much, that was really insightful, etc., etc. But
Yes.
to get them to participate in the first place is
Yes.
tough, because
Right.
there is this stigma that disability equals charity, and not necessarily the good kind of charity. A lot of people have this delicate tiptoeing on thin ice attitude towards disability. So they don't know what to
Right.
do about it. But when they come and they attend and they listen and they participate, they find that they learn a lot. So that's the first thing. Like, how do you catch their attention? How do you draw them in,
Yep. I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
So, do you have any advice for YES alumni who actually want to do projects that advocate for persons with disabilities in our community?
Specifically to advocate for persons with disability, the first thing to understand is that there are many types of disability, right? There
Yes.
are sensory disabilities, there are specific learning disabilities, to name a few, right?
Yes.
So to advocate for each one, you can't just umbrella it out in a short period of time. I mean,
Right.
honestly, you could do a whole entire postgraduate degree and you would probably still not cover everything that's got to do with disability.
Right.
But it's nonetheless a commendable effort. So if you
Mm-hmm.
choose to do such an activity, first of all is ask around, try
Mm-hmm.
to engage with advocates. So there are
Yes.
lots of advocates out there, non-governmental, non-profit organizations out there, and they will be willing to help, engage them, talk to them, listen, read. There are lots of things online. Just all you need to do is hit Twitter, follow some advocates with disability, and you'll be able to see lots and lots of comments and thoughts.
Right.
It's important to not generalize anything.
Mm-hmm.
The importance is, it's very important to make sure that your audience understand that disability is unique to each individual.
Yes.
So, yes. Another thing is that simulations is a very popular form of projects, so to
Yes.
speak,
Yep.
right? People like to
Mm-hmm.
simulate, for example, blindness. They blindfold
Yes.
the participants. It's, if you don't convey the message properly, your
Mm-hmm.
participants are just going to come out of that and say that they were terrified, it was horrible, they can't imagine life without sight, it was scary, okay? So it's very
Yes.
important that the message that reaches them has to be accurate. That,
Right.
if you choose to do simulations, you have to like explain that, it's not the end of the world, for example, and like what it means. Like that
Mm-hmm.
is a barrier, but um, how it is overcome. Another important thing that should be conveyed in these projects is that the barrier isn't caused by the disability itself. Barriers
Yes.
to access is caused by ableism. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
attitude of, say, for example, community around you.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah. So those
Mm-hmm.
are, to name a few. That's lots more that can be said, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's very important, especially in this age, that we have so much access to all these kinds of resources that we can have. And I think it's important that we utilize all these resources as well, as you said.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, what are some advice that you have in terms of creating inclusive projects that's not necessarily a project that is disability centered, by making sure that there's equal access to everyone that participates?
First of all, is your platform. The
Right.
platform that you reach out to people.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you're posting on Facebook promoting your project, right? You have a
Yes.
photo. Very typical is that people post posters,
Yes.
and this is
Mm-hmm.
not accessible because
Right.
sometimes it's just pictures, right? We live in a world that is so visually centered, for example.
Yes, we
Or
do.
you post videos, for example, and you talk in those videos.
Mm-hmm.
Without captions, and people with
Yes.
hearing, people who are hard of hearing or deaf won't be able to access the information. So it's a huge thing. Barriers to information is a huge problem
Yes.
in the disabled community. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the first thing to tackle. Another thing is
Right.
that your forms or whatever it is, your posters and stuff, you should always leave a space for people to disclose their disability and access needs.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, in your form, I noticed that a lot of forms do not have this. Is that
Mm-hmm.
probably, at the bottom after your name and your details, etc., you should probably have a box there saying that do you have any disability? Very common you
Right.
have like dietary requirement, right?
Yes, that's
So
true.
it's not that hard to add another column at the bottom saying, if you have any disabilities, please tell us, your access needs and stuff like that.
Yes.
Also, you can include your contact and tell them
Right.
that if anything, just contact you, that kind of thing. That's the first step.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, think about your logistics, a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whether it's, you maybe need a quiet room for people to calm down, for instance,
Yes.
in like big activities and all that. Or
Right.
accessibility in terms of the venue itself, for instance. So that's all very important. It can be very daunting for some disabled people to
Yes.
participate in activities that they do not know whether all these accessibility needs will be met. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think, yeah, as you said, it goes a really long way to just state what kind of accessibilities you can provide for them.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's always the first step is just to ask, to communicate, you know.
Yes.
And don't assume, never assume. So just because someone says that they are visually impaired, for instance, don't
Yes.
straight away jump to the conclusion that they read Braille, for example, and
Right.
go straight into it, for instance. Even a certain say if you talk about visual impairment, there is a wide range of difference in all sorts across a very wide spectrum, you see. So
Yes.
yeah, always ask, don't assume. I think that's a good motto to go by. Yep.
Okay. So, in terms of the projects that you have worked on in your personal experience, what kind of things have you done personally to ensure that your projects were inclusive and accessible?
As all those that I've mentioned before. Also, I think what I've done specifically is communicate back and forth with people who have mentioned that they have disability and make very sure to know exactly what they need, examples and stuff like that. It doesn't hurt to be prepared, for instance. So that's basically the things that, but also if they have any requirements, it can be, I understand that, for able people, it can be tough because not really understanding the disabled community, sometimes it can be tough to set up these requirements, for instance. I think, again, seek advice, read online. There are quite a lot of options out there. And also, for instance, if you need help, look for local support networks. Like, for example, you have the National Council for the Blind in Malaysia, or organizations like that, reach out to them if you need any help, for instance. Also, logistics is an important thing because, for instance, if you are, you're working on a project and you have to set out a certain budget and stuff like that, you set up with a hotel, for instance, but the hotel might not be fully accessible, so that can be a tough challenge to get around. So that was one thing that I had to go through a lot with them.
I see.
So
yeah. And so while working on these projects that you've done, what are some things that you found was surprising to you?
Surprising is, I think it's the reaction that the participants have. So often when you have like projects that are disability awareness centered, your participants naturally are able people, right? And they can be the reactions from them can be very wide ranged. It can be from like, great surprise to great, sometimes they can feel very sad, surprisingly. So yeah, those are the things that I found quite surprising, but nonetheless, it was an experience.
Right. So I think considering your surprised responses, right, what would you like to say to the community about dealing with persons with disabilities?
It's important to always ask. Don't just assume. That's very, very important. I cannot emphasize this enough. On a daily basis, I experience this a lot. For example, if I'm crossing the street, someone just grabs me. I know they want to help me, but, just grabbing someone and dragging them across the street is terrifying, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Or another thing is, maybe someone in a wheelchair and someone just comes along and like, let me push it for you. Like, no. I think it's also important to respect their integrity, their dignity, the dignity of persons with disability. So always respect that. So yeah, comes down to one thing: just ask, don't assume.
Yep. I see. So who are some people that you've actually collaborated with on your projects?
I think first and foremost, Mayusa, Disability International USA. They helped a lot in an international conference, for instance, that we had with YES Alumni a couple of
Yeah.
years back. We worked with the National Council for the Blind. We worked with a professor that I can't recall. Hang on, but her expertise is in disability in Malaysia, basically, and some
I
youth
see.
advocates.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the people that we've worked with in disability projects in Malaysia. We've also worked with University Malaya. University Malaya, and also some other we've collaborated with like some other associations to work out projects as well. So yeah.
And this project, I think if I remember correctly, it was a 4 days, 3 nights activity, right?
It was a conference. Yep.
Yeah. So what are some of the activities that you've had throughout this project?
A lot of it was understanding how anyone in the community can contribute. So like I said, up to 20% of the community is affected by disability. Anything you do, whatever path you take in life, you know, for instance, parking your car, don't park on top of pavements where wheelchairs or, you know, the blind might be walking, things like that, simple things. You can contribute, that kind of thing. So in the conference, we were talking a lot about that. And also we discussed how terminology affects people's perception of disability. For example, a lot of people like to call us differently abled. For example, I'm not X-Men. I don't come out with, I don't know, knives in my hands or something like that. You know, I'm not differently able like that. I can't fly. You know, not without an airplane. But there are still, that being said, though, there are still people with disability out there who prefer to be known as differently able. I think it's a process. So for me, myself, when I was very, very young, for instance, this is a bit off topic, but well, let's just talk about it anyway.
Yeah, go ahead,
So, you know, when you were very young and, you know, life was like pure optimism and all that, you think that, no, I'm not disabled, I can do anything, right? And then slowly you develop to the point where you just think that, okay, disability is something else, maybe differently able. And at some point for myself, I came to the point where, well, disabled pride, disabled is disabled. So, you know, there's no harm in saying it. I think that's the, you know, generally we prefer to just say it, disabled. It's not a taboo. It's not something for you to tiptoe around. But like I said, there are still people out there who prefer not to be, you know, labeled disabled, so to speak. So terminology is very important because that's how people view us. If you think that, if the way you speak of disability is such a timid way of saying it, then apparently everyone will just treat you at arm's length, you know? And that you know can cause us to feel very excluded socially. So yeah, that's one of the things. And we talked about barriers a lot in that conference, about how barriers are to be removed. Also about how in your profession specifically, like for example, if you're an architect, if you're designing a building, for instance, how do you make it as accessible as possible? If you're a web designer, things like that. So yeah, those are some of the things that we went through. And also we were talking about how all these projects can be done, you know, can be implemented. So for instance, a lot of companies have community responsibility sort of necessary requirements, for instance, right? So, you know, it's very easy to just use that space to advocate for disability, for instance. So yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And I think one other project that you've worked on was also Gift of Sight, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, that was very specific to visual impairment because obviously I'm, for those who have not noticed, maybe I'm blind. So yeah.
Yes.
Yes, that was another project.
So, could you talk more about what kind of activities that you've done through Gift of Sight?
Gift of Sight started off with making materials accessible for blind students. So this was after I left school, as
Okay.
in high school in Malaysia, right?
Yeah.
I collaborated with YES Alumni with this, and we got books that are not accessible. So in Malaysia, we don't have the privilege of having textbooks, even basic textbooks that are available
Right.
in braille or tactile diagrams. So what we did was we gathered volunteers and we create tactile diagrams specifically for mathematics and economics and other subject that has graphs and diagrams. So that was how it started. And then it slowly expanded to awareness about visual impairment.
Right.
So yeah, that's the GitHub side.
And what about some projects that you've done outside of YES Alumni? Do you have any that you'd like to share about?
Outside of it, it was a lot of speeches, lectures. I
Right.
did some with UNICEF, guest lectures at colleges, some companies, things like that. It was more of speak to them because especially with working adults, they don't really have the time to be going out there and doing. Maybe some of them do, but not all, right? So to reach them, that's how we reached. And also doing these projects, when you have a group of audience that are, for example, if you go to a law firm and do these kind of projects, they're all lawyers. So it's easier to tailor the content of your message to, be more impactful. So yeah. Speaking of which, when you were talking about advice as well earlier, I think it's also important that you really understand your target audience. So if your audience are students, cater your contents to their understanding, that kind of thing, for them to relate, to be able to relate better. Yep.
That's true. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Celine, for sharing so much information with us today. I hope that everyone who's been watching here today has been inspired by Celine to also advocate for persons with disabilities, as well as talk more about inclusivity as well as disability rights. Before we end in today's interview, Celine, do you have any last words to say?
I think it's important for everyone to talk about it. It's not something to hide away. So anyone can just suddenly turn out to be disabled. Not to be morbid or ominous here, but a lot of people, too many times able-bodied people, they're just complacent, and when it happens, they just feel lost, and sometimes support is not available readily, right? So it's no harm talking about it, and it's definitely something that we should be doing. In this 21st century era. So it's something that people ought to be having more conversations about. So yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
I definitely agree with you. Conversations open up talks about more and more issues, and I'm very, very happy that the world today is more accessible to starting more conversations about these things.
Yep, definitely.
Yep. All right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Celine.
It was great chatting with you.
Today.